session.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you're audible. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our next speaker is an erudite scholar and a well-known freelance copy editor, Dr. G.V. Naresh. He is presently working as Associate Professor of English in the New College, Chennai. He completed his PhD from IIT Madras in 1997. His areas of interest includes literature, theology, religion, philosophy, and literary theory. He has more than 23 years of teaching experience. He has published some articles at national and international research journals. Currently, he is MPhil and PhD guide at University of Madras. So far, he has guided to more than 25 MPhil and PhD scholars. Along with that, he has also experience of 20 years in the field of copy editing. His expertise lies in copy editing life science journals for Pearson, Springer, British Medical Journals, and Dove Medical Press. I welcome a versatile personality, Dr. G.V. Naresh, who is going to talk on reader response theory. Sir, the platform is yours now.
Thank you. Am I audible? Because I'm having some issues with my microphone.
You're audible, sir.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. Much obliged. So I deem it a great honor to be associated with this FDP program on literary theory and criticism, organized by the Department of English, KTHM College, Nashik. So I would like to express my thanks to the management of the college, the principal, Dr. Gaikwad, and in particular, Professor and the HOD, English Department, Dr. Sharad Binod, who was very kind and gracious to have included me in this litany of luminaries. So I am much humbled by this. And I also can see that large number of participants are taking part in this program. And though it is online, I'm delighted to meet all of you. And I suppose the organizers deserve all the credit for conducting an event of this magnitude. I know how difficult and challenging these events can be. So the response to the theme in terms of participation, the theme of the program, of course, is literary theory and criticism. I think it speaks volumes of the relevance and importance of this area of literary studies. Over the years, probably the last 10 or 15 years, we can see that there's been a lot of emphasis on this area. And the previous person also spoke on, Professor Bhatt, on cultural studies. And I think you've been discussing various ideologies like Marxism, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, and feminism. So now we come to one area which, in the kind of the structure of the schools of theory, sometimes is overlooked. Some texts on literary theory or critical theory usually there's a possibility that it's not included. Reason is, I suppose, it has implications that spreads not only to the other schools of theory, but to all branches of knowledge, as well as entire human life itself. So this session, of course, 1 hour or couple of hours on reader response theory is obviously grossly inadequate. So I can only touch upon certain important elements, and I'd like to focus on, let's say, as the theory, kind of foregrounds, one important dimension, which is meaning. I would like to see how reader response theory kind of challenges meaning, so to speak. So what are the implications of this method of criticism? So that would be my focus. And I have chosen a very small cultural illustration to highlight this method of criticism, reader response criticism. Hope it will be no successful. So I think my screen is visible to you. I hope. Can someone confirm it?
Yes, sir. It's
Wonderful.
visible, sir.
Yeah, great. So what I would be doing here in this, probably I have 1 hour and 15 minutes. Yes. So initially we look at some very simple definitions of what is meant by reader response theory / criticism, some background to the theory, and then this is the small illustration that I've selected to kind of show how reader response works when you apply it. And then we look at some influences going from there to the summary or the overview of whatever we have been discussing, and finally to the implications. And at the end of a very long day on theory, if participants do have something to share, I would be very happy. So this is a kind of broad approach that I will be following in this session. Okay, so straight away getting into the theory of reader response, properly speaking, should be hyphenated, reader response theory. So you have 3 components when you read any text. So we are of course not focusing on discourse per se, but on the text. So the author, of course, of the text, then the reader. So as the title itself indicates, this is a response of the reader. So the primacy is of the reader. So what happens to the author, what happens to the text is what reader response theoreticians tell us. So this is the kind of a very simplistic illustration or a diagram of reader response theory. And unlike set theory, where we'll talk about the common area, it doesn't work like that in human sciences. So let's not get into the mathematics of this diagram. Okay, so let's start with a very small kind of a starter, so to speak. So I've titled it perception. Perception is the way we look at things, obviously. So there is a picture here. It's titled a very grandly duck rabbit puzzle, but it's a very simple. I'm sure you've come across several of these, especially there's one of a woman, one part of it will be a young lady and the other part is a very elderly person. So you must have had occasion to look at that, kind of a trick image through a social media, WhatsApp or something like that. So this actually is, when you focus, kind of you shift your vision towards the left, you would see a duck or at least a duckling with the beak, being prominent. The looking left, obviously. And if you turn to the right, it's a kind of a rabbit. Of course, turn towards right. So what is the issue? I think this kind of captures what we are trying to look at, reader response theory. My focus is actually not so much to say that reader response would entail that the readers are free to interpret in any way as they like. That is not the intention or the goal of reader response theory, but it does bring out certain complications such as this image. Otherwise, you can look at one more. Another again, I think it's a very common image. Certainly you must have come across, or children at home, probably they would have come across this diagram or illustration. So you can find this. I'm sure, I think, in some films also, this issue is utilized very effectively by the hero to get hold of a villain and all that. The 6 number will be inverted into 9 or vice versa. So obviously the person in the left looks at this number, it is 6, and the person that is looking from the right, that is my right, that is it is 9. See, these 2 images may look very simple, but I think they contain a lot of implication, which we'll see little later. Okay, so applying it to kind of a literary example, I think some of you may have come across this during your college days. Probably there was a debate also. I had one when I was at college. So the true hero of Milton's Paradise Lost, is it God or is it Satan? So is Satan the hero or is he the evil protagonist or antagonist, so to speak? So we would be divided into two groups, and the teacher would ask us to take, it's kind of a debate like. So all these three, I just kind of very simplistically put it as reader response theory. So three aspects. So this is how a reader will look at an image and a response that is given, and there is a kind of a theoretical background to this entire reader response. So this, I got this from the internet. Kind of, again, it portrays the kind of varying perceptions that we have of the same scenario, even though one is heaven, other is hell. But with respect to Milton's Paradise Lost and the character of Satan, probably it makes sense. So welcome to heaven, here is your harp. Or welcome to hell, here's your accordion. So what is the difference between a harp and an accordion? So it's a mind that makes heaven of hell, hell of heaven, so to speak. Okay, so this is a very small intro or a starter to reader response. I think you have probably, in a sense, whatever I'm going to discuss is not new. I would only hope that I'll be able to, because it's like any other school of theory, it is very vast. So many practitioners are there, so many sub schools are there within reader response theory. So what I can hope to do is kind of bring in some kind of unity to this entire area. So not necessarily I'm going to share something totally new. I am very certain that many of you have done some reading on reader response and you are reasonably well prepared. Okay, so this is a very simplistic introduction. So kind of what is, because I'm using these terms, like I suppose very often we come across this. In some places it's reader response theory, other places it is reader response criticism. So what is criticism theory? Very simply put, criticism is applied theory. So you have a good text. I think some of you are familiar with this, called Critical Theory Today. I prefer Louis Tyson, quite good text on many of these theories. If you are looking for a introduction, probably this is a good place to start. Critical Theory Today by Louis Tyson, where obviously I think very early he, I think it's a she. So suggests that when we interpret a text, we are doing criticism. That is, when you are applying a theory to a text, that is criticism, obviously. And the very theory that we have, kind of the basis or the foundation, or what we say, set of assumptions or criteria on which the interpretation rests, that is obviously the theory. So literary criticism is nothing but the application of critical theory to a text. So it is, like I said, it's applied theory, so to speak, criticism. So in case there is some kind of, because often I get asked this question, how do you distinguish? So the reason I cited this author is because several times I have titled it reader response criticism and sometimes it's theory. So this serves to explain that. And very simply, these next couple of slides, the overview of the entire spectrum of theory. So why do we need theory? Because a very noted Johns Hopkins Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism, in the preface, very clean or a neat reason for theory is given. I think 3 parts are there for this. So one is the theory gives us basic definitions. So theory is nothing but definitions. A lot of what I will be doing is actually basic definitions. Then it is also a search for something that will help us to evaluate text, or what you said as evaluating critical practice. So how do we evaluate text? Let's say a brand new author comes to us and gives us a text. Not the canonical writers, very easy for us to kind of be biased into praising. But a very new writer comes, how do we evaluate that? Whether it's literature, whether it's not literature, it's popular literature, and so on and so forth. So we need certain basis, a foundation or a theoretical framework, so to speak. So largely theory is required for helping us provide value to the text, because we need a method of doing it. It's not like it's an instinctive feeling, or it's the earlier liberal humanistic tradition. Certain writers or critics, or the Samuel Johnson or someone else, they would have a feel about a text, and then they would probably decide it's good or bad, and the subsequent readers follow. No, that's not the way it should be done. So, and the third is, of course, it is a process that foregrounds the social, historical, and I think Amit Kumar, he needs to mute. Okay. So social, historical, or ideological interests. What are the ideological assumptions that are made in the theory? So these are the three aspects of the requirement for theory, and a broad kind of enumeration of the various theories, which starting with liberal humanism, then you have formalism, psychoanalytical. It's not necessarily chronological, so I'm sure this is not new for you. So maybe perhaps ending up in cultural studies, this could be the latest way of looking at text. Okay, so somewhere here we should have, reader response criticism. Fine. So what is the hypothesis that I like to defend, or kind of argue about, is one, the centrality of reader response theory. Reader response theory is not a theory that is only applicable to a study of literary texts. It's not only a theory, let's say, that we find in literary criticism or literary theory, and which helps us to evaluate a literary text. No, as we have seen. So it is not necessarily that, because the findings, so to speak, of reader response theory actually are applicable to all branches of epistemology, all branches of knowledge, sciences, social sciences, probably even management sciences, and so on and so forth, whatever it may be, engineering, professional, all branches of sciences, because obviously it goes back to the structuralist kind of emphasis, to semiotics, to sign, to language. So how we interpret language, how we interpret text. So it is applicable to all branches of knowledge, to education, and to, in a larger way, to every human activity. Because simply put, or looking at it from another perspective, so to speak, within quotes, single quotes, it deals with how we deal with humans, how we understand each other or misunderstand each other. We talk about reading and misreading. So reader response theory, the kind of assumptions that are made and certain claims that are made by several of these theoreticians are not merely something that is connected with literary studies, this is my contention, but to knowledge itself and to human beings in general. Okay, so this is a contention. Of course, I'm not sure I'll have time to, but hopefully by looking at the background and the influences and looking at the overview, this should become simpler. So I would kind of repeat or reiterate myself and say that this theory is very, very crucial. It goes beyond literary studies. So that's the hypothesis that I am making. Fine. So dimensions of reader criticism, we have seen that diagram already about the text, the author, and the reader. So you have a similar visual representation here. So you have the author, you have the reader, you have the text. So I think this kind of very succinctly captures what takes place in reader response criticism. So I've just put this certain places I put it diagrammatically instead of writing it down in some bullet form or point form. So I very interesting. Why I like this illustration is this image is they are not kind of showing an interrelation between, let's say, author and text and reader and so on. So there is a kind of a central aspect, so to speak, which is meaning, and it is meaning which kind of interacts with the three other, possibly fourth component of this reader response criticism. So it's a meaning that deals with author, with the writer and the meaning, the text and the meaning, reader and the meaning, and perhaps, especially because of people like Stanley Fish who talk about interpretive communities, etc. So we also have other readers, so to speak, who also react with meaning. So the meaning is a central component. So you, for example, cannot have a reader and author kind of interaction, or you cannot even have a reader and a text kind of interaction. It may sound or look very, let's say, extravagant, but I think the criticism is actually on this, the centrality of meaning. But one part of it is, of course, that the reader is privileged, not the author, not even the text. Text, in fact, comes to life, putting it very simply. The text comes to life through the reader. In other words, the text is purely an object or something inanimate. So the reader, in the process of giving meaning or in the process of interacting with meaning, actually gives some substance to the text. In a way, he or she deconstructs the text, even though deconstruction is actually speaking something different. Okay, so meaning takes primacy as well as reader. What happens to author? Obviously, we'll look at it a bit later, and we all know that authors in contemporary studies is, of course, he's dead or she's dead. So no need to look at the author. Okay, so very basic definitions of reader response criticism. It is nothing but the reader's response to the text. So reader response, it's self-explanatory actually, the nomenclature. So it's the response of the reader to the text and the process in which that response takes shape. So the role of the reader, which becomes important in reader response, and the processes through which the meaning is transferred to the reader. Ultimately, it's not even the processes, it's just the reader. So you may wonder, I mean, this is something self-evident, but if not so path-breaking as Newton's, discovery of gravity by Clay, by understanding that there's no reason for the apple to fall. This has not come, excepting through a long history, which we'll see, especially the predecessor or the previous, theory, there is new criticism, did not bother about the reader at all. So what looks very obvious and self-evident is actually speaking not so, because when you look at the earlier theories, there's hardly a mention of the reader, only about the text. So that's why reader response criticism is nothing but what the term that we use, foregrounding, pushes to the front, not background, not puts it behind, but pushes to the front the role of the reader. So reader becomes in fact, in many ways, the only component. The author is not required. Even the text is not required in a sense. So the reader's response to the text, to the literary text, and the role of the reader, which becomes important in understanding literature. Okay. And another aspect of it is, again, this is not what has been understood a little earlier, probably in 1960s, 70s. So there has been earlier some theories like phenomenology in philosophy, hermeneutics in theology. So that kind of paved the way for reader response, as well as in literature, new criticism. It is a reaction against new criticism. But even this kind of finding, so that different people read differently, read the same text differently, almost like Heraclitus, who said that you cannot step on the same water twice because the water has changed, and so have you. The water is not the same entity, nor are you the same entity. So that very famous statement of Heraclitus, this is applicable not just to different individuals who are reading the same text. Sometimes it is applicable to the same individual, that is yourself or someone else, who reads a text probably over a span of time. I'm sure many of you, those who are somewhat older, who have reread texts, sometimes will discover meaning that you thought was not there when you read it first or earlier. And in some cases, probably you find the text not so attractive as it had been in the first reading. So I'm sure you have found that. So this is the same individual also. These are the three important aspects. Of course, this is the reason why you have reader response in the first place. The earlier criticisms were focusing on the author or the text. So this is the reactionary kind of a school of thought. Okay. So taking from this, simplifying it further, reader response critics, they actually claim a text is incomplete until someone reads it. Or like I said, text is brought to life once the reader kind of activates it. So till then it is kind of, in a single quote, dead. Okay. So also the role of the reader is emphasized, or even as we say, another term, critical term, privileged in this writer text reader nexus. Okay. So these are the two takeaways from reader response criticism. One is that the reader brings meaning to the text, and second, the reader becomes primary in this triumvirate of writer, text, and reader. This is in a very, 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 very simplistic and probably in a sense erroneous also, because when you simplify things, they really do not capture the essence. So, but for like I said, kind of a working definition, this will be very good place to start with reader response criticism. So these next two slides are technical. So this is again taken from Louis Tyson. So I don't want to go into this because it's very complicated, and the reason why I don't want to get into this right now is obviously lack of time. So I just would like to indicate to you the types of reader response. So once you get into reader response theory, per se, the entire discourse, you will find maybe a couple of things. One, there is no set of single unified principle behind theory, meaning there are several approaches. In fact, you can apply reader response theory to reader response theory and bring out different perspectives. One instance, 5 classifications have been given, and another source, 7 have been given. So let's not get into these debates, but it merely means that there are different ways of looking at reader response theory, different practitioners, one, and in several cases, these practitioners also have evolved, so to speak. There, good example is Stanley Fish. So his idea of reader response has evolved. At least critics have identified 3 phases in his journey on this reader response theory. So it's very difficult to give a single paragraph or a single kind of response to what is theory. Like, for that matter, any school of theory, whether it's structuralism, or there have been so many people, post-structuralism, postmodernism, especially, though it's not a theory, it's only a condition, but still we treat it as a theory. So in all these cases, there are people who are key figures who did change their position, or sometimes have even reversed their position. No, for example, no, you think of James Joyce as a writer. He started off being a modernist. So in Ulysses, you will find that as a very good example of high modernism. So that's a text where you study Joyce as a modernist. But then the last subsequent work, Finnegan's Wake, he becomes a postmodernist. So Roland Barthes, another good example, his mythologies is an excellent exercise in structuralist methodology. So anyone who wants to understand know how structuralism can be put into application can read the series of essays on from everything to soaps to wrestling. He discusses in that text called Mythologies, and towards the end there is there's a theory, a big essay, explaining his rationale. But subsequently, we are going to just refer to that also, Death of the Author. We find Barthes as a post-structuralist. So it's very difficult to fix the person and fix kind of, let's say, a single unified response to these theories. It's immensely complex. Several people have been involved, and in reader response, like I suggested, it kind of starts off from, in fact, properly put, it starts off from the classical criticism of Aristotle and Plato. So recently, to phenomenology and hermeneutics, and from post-structuralism, which itself offshoot of structure, so on and so forth. So transactional reader response theory, one of the branches of reader response theory, affective stylistics of Stanley Fish, subjective reader response theory, then psychological reader response theory and social reader response theory. You can probably divide these two classifications into maybe three main components. One is personal or subjective, the other is psychological, and third is social. And with this is also added somewhere little later, I think I mentioned gender approach also. So gender practitioners or those who are looking at issues of gender, like let's say the forming of the canon, where the patriarchal kind of bias is seen in the framing of the canon. So reader response theory is sometimes taken hold of by gender theorists to support the contention that literature or literary theory is also kind of having or showing gender bias. Okay, so these are the ways in which, so a couple of one or two different ways in which this textual approach is something little different here, and you also don't have the historical context. So historical context also can be seen as one big area of reader response theory. So first of all, subjective approach, then you can have psychological approach, then the historical approach, as well as the social approach. So you can maybe bring in the gender component under the social approach. So this is just for your kind of reference. I've mentioned it's not possible to go, and also it's extremely difficult to conveniently show the there's a lot of overlap between these kind of classification. So that's one more reason. Okay. So some of the key figures here, Wolfgang Iser, Robert Yost, then Stanley Fish, Norman Holland, David Bleek, Gerald Prince. These are names you'll come across quite often in reader response study. Okay. So this is to do with the classifications and the definition. So what exactly is the background of how did it start? Like I mentioned, it starts off with Aristotle and Plato, actually, in terms of catharsis, which talks about the effect the text has. In that sense, actually, it's drama, the effect of drama on the audience. So there's a purging of emotion Aristotle speaks of. This is nothing but, let's say, the affective stylistics of Stanley Fish. How it affects with an A, not an E, A. Affect theory is a theory of emotion. So a reader response, in a sense, has its a genesis in classical criticism. And Plato, of course, also, who talked about the dangers of being misguided by the rhetoric of writing. So both actually talked about the effect of literature on the reader or on the audience. So of course, in contemporary times, this kind of a historical date, so to speak, sometime around the 1970s. In fact, a lot of these theories, including post-structure, all these 1970s seem to be a very crucial period, that decade. And sometimes I find, or I think that probably here in India, we seem to have kind of discovered these schools, or discovering these schools a little late, because at least in the US, from what I understand, they have kind of gone beyond theory. So the kind of impact that theory seems to have for literary academicians and students in our times here in India probably is absent in the US, and probably even in France and Europe, UK also. What I understand. I hope I've not given you a misleading statement. So calling this a movement is not correct. It's a false nomenclature, because this criticism is less a unified critical school than, this is a term that is used from critic on reader response, a vague collection of disparate critics with a common point of departure. So the common point of departure is, of course, referring to the new critical emphasis on the text. So they do not share a body of critical principles. For example, Marxism, or maybe even feminism and other isms. Okay, so there is no unified critical. It's not a unified critical school, and you do not have, let's say, a single set of principles, or a single principle, excepting for the fact that meaning is created by that alone is not Then the couple of definitions we have seen, the end of reader response, it's not the way to look at it, because really there is so much of issues involved with reader response. It takes a long time actually to access it. Okay, so these are important elements to keep in mind, because you will find different ways of looking at reader response by the different critics. So what exactly is this, and how is, for example, it different from reception? Even here you will find that several times they're treated synonymously. Reception theory is treated as a synonymous term for reader response, even though it's slightly different. So this is a kind of a subjective kind of reader criticism, reader response. And reception theory is also subjective, but reader response is the response of an individual. Simply put, reception theory is group of individuals, especially over a period of time. But the response is vis-a-vis the text. That is common in both. Okay, so this is the background of the reader response theory. So we kind of started off with the classical writers, and then we have understood actually that in fact this is probably true for so many other schools also, like I said, post-structuralism and so on. So what is the basis of the reader response criticism? So it is nothing but the rejection of the new critical principle, the principle of new critics, especially the affective fallacy, and the intentional fallacy, which the new critics also propagate, of course, is much more accepted by reader response. So affective fallacy is nothing but the effect the text has on the writer. I refer to Aristotle. So according to new critics, this is not a criterion at all. Text and only the text, that is everything. Text is the world, so to speak. Okay. So, but reader response critics obviously take the presence of the reader as an important or a decisive component in any meaningful literary analysis. So it is many ways you can see it is a reactionary school of thought to new criticism. As Michel Riffatere says, readers make the literary event. The event is nothing but, apologies for the wrong word. Okay, font issues. Okay, readers make the literary event. Literary event is not completed or kind of finished when the author does away with the text, but actually the literary event commences and is completed in a sense, at least, when the reader obtains or kind of extracts some meaning out of the text. So a very important statement by Rifat Arey. Then three terms which will come across reader response material. One is a narrative. Oh, this is a very common word, but since Gerald Prince, one of the practitioners, has used it, so it's nothing but the person to whom the narrator is addressing. This actually can go with another term called implied reader. This distinction is useful to keep in mind because when the author is actually writing, he or she has an implied reader, if you like, an ideal reader, so to speak, whom the author kind of communicates himself or herself to, or kind of writes the text for. So this is the implied reader, but we are looking at the actual reader in reader response criticism. So the actual reader, the real reader, or the real life reader, so to speak, this is the ideal reader, this is the real life reader, the reader in flesh and blood, so to speak, not the abstract reader. He or she is a person who brings things. Of course, things means some kind of meaning. Okay, meaning, again, see, if you're going to interrogate all these terms, who is a reader, who is, it goes on. So I'm assuming all those things. So what is meaning? So we can continue from that source. That again, we need probably at least a full day workshop or something on reader response, which we don't have the time for. So this is another. These are certain distinctions that you can keep in mind, like reader response and reception theory. This is one more, implied and actual reader. And certain writers, okay, some important statements. So we have seen one by Michel Rifat Arey, then Wolfgang Iser, another important, again, Iser comes under phenomenology, comes under hermeneutics, comes under reader response. So difficult to distinguish. They have influence depending on what text you're referring, etc., and what emphasis they may come under. So I'm not going into those kind of classifications. You need to understand why I'm doing that. So Iser talks about indeterminacies. So something that is not determinate or fixed, or gaps, that is a term that is used in post-structuralism or deconstruction, which the reader has to fill in, so to speak. So this is the emphasis. Then Stanley Fish, these obviously indicate that the earlier assumption, that means assumption that something we take for granted, no? So an assumption that the reader is someone who probably is in the background or is not considered, is what is being challenged actually, that you have to keep that in mind constantly. The primacy of the reader is definitely emphasized in reader response criticism. So again, Stanley Fish says in one, because like I said, three phases are there in his reader response thinking or thought. So in one phase at least, where this is probably the second phase, is there a text in class? He says that what happens to and with the participation of the reader? What happens to the text with the participation of the reader is the meaning of the text. What happens to the text with the reader? So not where is the author here? So this is again a crucial statement. So reader critics admit, however, if this actually is not total pure subjectivity, so to speak. That means each one interpreting text as per their own. For example, there's a community that is talked about, the Stanley Fish interpretative community, wherein which there are certain rules and norms with which we agree. For example, let's say the symbol of dove. So it is for peace, stands for peace. So I can't say dove is a symbol of war, for example, and then say that's my meaning I get. So that's a danger. Please do not misread reader response criticism as anything goes. It's not that. Reader response criticism doesn't mean anything goes, but it understands, or at least it brings into contention and dimension that was hitherto neglected, that of the reader. And of course, saying that the reader creates the meaning of the text. This does not rule out misreading, even in reader response criticism. So that is another dimension we have to keep in mind. So we need a context, so to speak. We need a context for reading also. If you do it or take it out of context, then it is not going to end up in the a transfer of meaning. That is, the communicative process would be affected or challenged if you do not contextualize the act of reading. And you can have probably 3 or 4 contexts, maybe a cultural or social context, interpretive communities, according to Stanley Fish. The psychological context, where this branch of reader response criticism focuses on what happens in the psyche of the reader. So we are looking at meaning, one part, but the psychoanalytical approach talks about what happens into the, let's say, what happens when a person is very deeply affected by a particular text. So you read a text, let's say Madame Bovary, and you are deeply, let's say, troubled by it for some reason. So why does that take place? So a psychoanalyst or the Freudian psychoanalysis will look at that process. So psychological context is a very fascinating area of reader response criticism. Again, I can only just hint at it because of lack of time. So Norman Holland, this is the context that is given by him, or the emphasis given by him. Historical context. So this is actually speaking reception theory. So horizon of expectations, a term, a very famous term used by Hans Robert Hughes. And gender, like I said, the gender theory started also applying reader response and trying to kind of have rereadings of even traditional texts, and they are able to see certain gender biases or prejudices in even well-known authors. So Fetterly, Judith Fetterly is one example. And again, some more very important definitions, semi-definitions. So David Bleek, he says that reading is a wholly subjective process. It's not objective at all. So one other way to understand reader response is to kind of differentiate between objectivism and subjectivism. That's also a nice way to look at it. Then, so whatever said and done, whatever context you are applying, it is true that reader criticism challenges the assumption that was made earlier of a unified, single, definitive meaning in a kind of a straightforward manner. So let's say, the traditional questions that are given to the students, for example, do a thematic study or a character analysis, or things like that. Of course, even there you can bring in reader response, but the fact that you're asking that kind of question implies that there seems to be a very kind of limited answer. Something that is deviant may not be accepted unless it's really a new interpretation. So even the critics who argue for right and wrong, that is the traditional critics who are evaluating literature, those who look at the valuation of literary text, what is right and wrong, probably a modernist approach if you want to see, even they have actually become kind of cautious about interpretation itself as a procedure, and how little or how misguiding the text itself is in the process of creating meaning. So interpretation as a procedure which was taken for granted, and the text is the proper guide for meaning. That is, in essence, in a nutshell, the contention of new critics. They said text is everything. So the text contains the meaning. If you work hard enough, or if you apply the tools properly speaking, if you are competent, then you get the meaning of the text. So, but reader response criticism at least has a kind of today even question. We'll see that little later. The role of a critic itself. So where does criticism come in? When you are saying that the reader brings out the meaning from the text, hopefully putting it in the proper context, where is the role of the critic? So there is no need for the reader to kind of agree or disagree, or there is no need for the reader to be attested by the critical opinion. So the entire set of, they become, so to speak, unemployed critics. Okay, so that is one more aspect of the reader response. So as far as definitive meaning, so this is one more dimension that comes simultaneously of post-structuralist thought, etc. We have free play of Derrida. We see that little later. So definitive meaning is no longer possible. There's no question of a single unitary definitive correct meaning in a text. So likewise, definitive evaluation. So evaluation is even more contextually determined than meaning. So what is meaningful to one may not necessarily be meaningful to another. I'll give you a small example. Let's say a text, of patriotic song, so to speak. Now it depends on which side of the wall that you are falling in. So if the person belongs to the group or to the nation that you are involved in, that patriotic songs become more meaningful. But if you are from the other side, probably the side, they would probably tend to take these as not patriotic, but kind of a challenge to authority. So it's difficult to even differentiate something meaningful. So we may appreciate something as patriotic, but it depends on the perspective. We go back again to the first part of the seminar. So value is increasingly viewed not as a quality present somehow in the text. Like, you cut open a mango, there's a seed, that is the value, that is the quality. No, but the so-called value itself is a product of social, historical, and cultural circumstances or context. So this decides whether something is valuable or invaluable. Sometimes it is possible a person whom you thought later on a few other things come out in the open, and then you probably revise your opinion. So what is the value then, so to speak? So value is also constantly changing. Meaning is changing. Meaning is not determined. Value is changing. Value is not determined. So these are all the kind of challenges that reader response criticism has given to us. Okay, I think I just have probably barely half an hour. We need to speed up a little bit. So we have been looking at a couple of aspects. One is the definition and classification and the background. So I just have taken this very small cultural slogan, so to speak. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. Nike, largely associated with shoes, footwear, but they are also into clothing. So kind of fashion or clothing people they are. So this slogan, just do it. I'm sure you have come across with this swoosh. It's called a swoosh. Sometimes Nike is there. Very often they don't even, I think the recent ones, they don't even use that word Nike because it's so universally famous. It's one of the most successful advertising slogans in the history of modern commerce. Just do it. Phenomenally successful. So maybe kind of if I take off from the earlier session on cultural studies. So this is a kind of a cultural symbol, so to speak, of our times. Even though it's probably around 30 plus years. 1988 actually this was released into the public. So no Nike, there's no company name. Just do it. Swoosh. Okay. So obvious question. What do you mean by? What do you mean? Mean. Emphasis on mean. Mean by just do it. There's a period here. So it's a statement. Just do it. What do you mean? So I have kind of given normal circumstances. Interactive session would be wonderful, but online complications and restrictions. So I have put in these few possible meanings. So definitely, as many participants are there, probably there are so many meanings of just this imperative or declaration, just do it. One, is it a lover kind of proposing to his beloved? Two minds, should I not? Right person, wrong person, no, just do it. An employee thinking of resignation. Difficult choice always, especially when you don't have something to compensate in place already. So can I, should I, or should I not? a businessman, a new investment, a new enterprise. So is it going to work out? Will I lose great or suffer great losses? Family considering relocation. Even I've just deliberately taken this as a possibility. A person contemplating suicide. Just do it. It has different meanings to these people. It can be a proposal, it can be investment, it can be a challenge to a career change, it can be relocation. It depends on obviously the context. We have seen this. So just one statement. This is not a literary text of, let's say, 300, 400 pages. It's just a few what you call possible context. What if this same thing is repeated several times in a page and in multiple pages and hundreds of pages? So this do it guidance has different meanings. One such as proposal, then investment, a career change, and so on. So what is the original meaning? Why did the American public, for whom it was introduced first, really taken up by this slogan, so to speak? So for them, they actually thought that this is a call for kind of motivating yourself, pull yourself up. Come on, it's kind of motivating yourself to achieve greater things, doing newer things, or doing better things, or doing perfect things, so on and so forth, because the country on the move always. So they found it extremely meaningful, this slogan, and that is one of the reasons why. So in many ways, the cultural context, it kind of appealed to the cultural sentiment of Americans. So just do it. I don't know. Let's say in a corona environment, I'm not sure whether this will. That's another kind of study that we can do, in fact. Whether this slogan would have worked in the last couple of years. I'm not sure. Okay, so it's been highly successful. So we have looked at all this. This is a kind of a motivational slogan, a slogan of inspiration. Maybe it's the original meaning associated with general citizens, and a few possible meanings. But many, probably a few of you will be aware, but may not be many. The actual context of this slogan, how it was formed. It is the dying words of a murderer who's actually going to be executed. A person called Gary Gilmore, who's at least, I think, murdered 2 people in a very gruesome manner in 1976, July 1976. Subsequently, he's caught and he's sentenced to death, and he accepts his guilt, and he wanted to be executed by a firing squad. So Gary Gilmore, 1976, he wanted to be due process of law is applied, and he wanted to be executed by the firing squad, and he wanted them to execute him as soon as possible. He was very much particular that they complete the capital punishment as soon as. But I think twice he gets a stay of execution. One, I think, by his mother, because his mother appeals, and one some group, human rights activist group, and he is really furious by this delay. And finally, when he was going to be executed on January 17, 1977, some 6 months down the line, before the riflemen, they were firing the shots, not poison injection or something. He wanted to face the firing squad. He is said to have officially spoken these words, "Let's do it. Let's do it." And this case actually captured the imagine of Americans, because they really admired this person. Okay, he's a murderer, and he's going to meet his fate, and he deserves all that is there. But his fearlessness, his willingness to confront his punishment. In fact, he was very unhappy that the punishment is delayed. So when he just said, "Let's do it," it became a big sensation. So Gary Gilmore kind of became paradoxically a cult figure. And subsequently, when an advertising agency for Nike, they wanted, and they were aware of this, in Utah, US, the kind of impact, and also in general, United States. So they turned the slogan instead of "Let's just do it." And rest, as they say, is history. So there is a background, a context to this "just do it," a kind of rereading, so to speak, of the original statement, "Let's do it, just do it." But can we really get this meaning? This, let's just say this is the authorial intention. Original meaning is the authorial intention, and this is the reader response. We are not aware of the context, like just how we cannot get into the mind of the author, obviously. That's why the intentional fallacy, which probably is correct by the new critics. So, no, how can we arrive at the original meaning? It's not possible. This, of course, we know because we read history, it's available on the net. You can just have a look at it. But normally speaking, we are not aware of the background of. So we create our own meanings. And which meaning is correct? No. And the meaning, like I said, varies. Just do it 10 years back, 5 years back, 3 years back. Just do it now. Yes, there's a difference of. I think I tried to kind of use this as a small slogan to, to capture the processes that take place in reader response criticism. Okay. So, of course, again, like we talked about context, there are also types of discourses. These are open statements. No, for example, just do it. Obviously, or do what you'll ask. So, in a sense, no point in actually talking about reader response in an open statement like this. You have partially open text such as literary works, which will contain some information as well as gaps. The indeterminacy of the text happens because of the gaps, actually, not because of the open statements. For example, a particular character is 20 years of age in the text. There is no confusion regarding that piece of information that comes to any reader, no matter when you read, how many different ways you read it. Okay, but the other gaps that are present, so to speak, which because no text is complete, even a very complete text will have, that's how you have so many deconstructed readings today taking place. So apparently closed texts also are actually open. So, but this is not so open or so let us say without any base, such as Nike just do it. And there is the other extreme. So literature probably is in the middle part. So the other extreme is scientific discourses. So there is much less room in a scientific discourse for you to have reader response, kind of reaction. Not possible. So the theory of relativity, I can't respond to it. No, gravity, 9 point, no, for me it is 8.9. It's ridiculous. So scientific discourses are kind of totally closed. So this is open, this is closed. Maybe literature is somewhere in between. But definitely we have to admit that earlier we used to think that even literature was a kind of a scientific discourse. And if you work hard enough, if you battle hard enough, or if you dig deep enough, you will get the complete meaning of the text. That today, of course, thanks to reader response, we know is not the case. So the response to text varies depending on the kind of text it is, and the meaning proportionately is differently created. Okay, so that is one take off from this Nike slogan. And so we have one side, we have the context. So the context of the text or the statement or discourse. And we also have the personality and culture of the reader. So these two are guiding factors in the creation of meaning. And so you have this variance. The variance happens because the context is different. Let's say 100 years down the line, someone is reading. Definitely, unless you're a very deep follower of the history of things, you would surely not at all know that this is a kind of a criminal, words of a criminal, so to speak, that have been rephrased. We will not know. So context is going to change the meaning and the personality and culture. And so we have, so to speak, signifieds which are floating. And we can at best get a trace. The meaning is only a trace, to borrow the term from Derrida. Okay. So this is regarding that Nike slogan. So I'll need to rush through the influences, probably the other schools of thought and some writers I've just enumerated here for our own understanding. Like I said, probably it's an offshoot first and foremost from phenomenology to hermeneutics. Then you had this Russian formalism. In US, it was new criticism. So reader response is a reaction to new criticism. Then post-structuralism, especially Barthes and Derrida. So, reader response theory takes off from these two, new criticism and post-structuralism. And you may have slightly two variants, reception theory and reader response theory. Reception theory is how the text is received, but in groups of readers over a period of time. Whereas reader response theory is more individual based. They don't talk about, even though here also the sharing of meaning, comparing of meaning is done across individuals, but not across time at least. So reader response theory probably doesn't emphasize that so much. So if you would like a historical overview, Sheldon Widdowson, the text, Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory, you have an excellent overview present. So very quickly, phenomenology, nothing but how meaning or consciousness or understanding actually is not present outside the mind, so to speak. So that's why I said nothing beyond the mind. So putting it very crudely, let's say there are aliens in the moon. It doesn't make any difference to me because I have not seen them. They have not appeared to me. So only that which my mind can access, that becomes reality, that becomes truth. That is phenomenology. So I think very closely you can see the parallel to text and the meaning of the text. So what the author intended, what is reality, what is truth within quotes? No, it's not important. What means to me is actually what is important. So human mind is the center and origin of meaning. So I'll rush through this. I'm sorry, I think don't have time. In hermeneutics, again, the same problem. Hermeneutics is actually a method in theology, Christian theology, Bible interpretation of Bible. There was some debate or there was some kind of, let's say, a difference of or clash of interpretations. So then they thought, okay, we need to fix actually how the Bible should be read because there seemed to be so much of disagreement. Let us agree on the method of interpretation. So that hermeneutics actually is a very, very important branch of study. This is common again to several other disciplines as well. Okay, so even they talk about the theory of interpretation, of the methods, of the procedures, of the principles involving in extracting meaning. So of course it was originally applied to getting the meaning from the Bible, but later on literary theories, reader response theories also applied this. Okay, this is hermeneutics. New criticism, like phenomenology where nothing beyond the mind. New criticism, opposite, they say nothing beyond the text. So you can't go beyond the text. And so they are not at all bothered about the reader. They are not interested actually in the reader. They only look at the text. They are not even interested in the authorial intention, so to speak. So intentional fallacy is what they promote. That is, you have to avoid it. So they only consider the text and nothing but the text. And they also say the text is closed. Text is autonomous, independent, and everything that you need to know is within the text. So close reading is what they have actually supported or promoted, which is also what actually even Derrida says in Deconstruction. Okay, so Derrida also says something similar, nothing beyond the text, but his emphasis is more closer to reader response theory. He does not talk about a determinate single meaning. He talks about instability of meaning, and he says that a text will possess many different meanings, that it cannot have a meaning, a single meaning. So there is no single guaranteed essential meaning. So this is very close to reader response theory. Reception theory, like I said, it talks about the response of the individuals over a period of time. So how much a text alters over time, that's how they see. Is same methodology as reader response actually. And the key figures from phenomenology, Husserl, Edmund Husserl, then reception theory, Hans Robert Hughes. Then in reader response theory, you have Hisse. Like I said, he also comes in reception. So classifications are always a very challenging task. Of course, Stanley Fish is a proper reader response theoretician. Then some key texts. One, of course, death of the author. The conclusion, we all know this. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. I think very, very succinctly capturing the spirit of reader response theory. Birth of the reader. Then Stanley Fish, it's both an article as well as text. So where he says the instability of the text and the unavailability of determinate meanings. So text is unstable, instable. So and there is no availability of determinate meaning. So you have a concept called indeterminacy, which simply means you cannot fix the exact meaning of a text. So meaning is indeterminate, or it is determinate on other factors such as context and culture and so on. Interpretive communities, because it will end in total chaos and disaster. If this is true, then whatever I've been saying and you are listening is actually without any point, because you've totally understood it in your own way. I have totally communicated it. So it is not that. There are certain set of guiding principles or norms or ways in which we understand meaning. So that is also true. Affective stylistics, how it affects, or the way in which a text affects the reader. This is Stanley Fish. These are certain key concepts. So indeterminacy, like I said, depends on the effect on the reader. Okay, that is how you see indeterminacy. Then how indeterminacies can multiply in accordance to length. Like I said, a Nike slogan is just 3 words, but a text is immensely long. So just imagine the misreadings that can take place. So it's very vast. Interpretive communities of fish, it denotes a notional group. This is a kind of a check actually on interpretation, kind of, let's say, kind of a breakdown of, like subjective meaning leading to a breakdown of communication itself. That cannot take place because members employ a shared set of assumptions and strategies when when interpreting a given text. But actually, again, then we come back to the problem then. Will this not kind of put a check on the kind of interpretation or positivity of interpretation? So this is a question that we can ask. Okay. Then affective stylistics. Okay, this is actually that the notion that the text is the event that occurs in time 1. Okay, then we need to examine closely the text to see how it affects the reader. How the text, that is stylistics, affects the reader. Okay, this is the way affective stylistics works. Okay, and one example is, let's say you parallel the experiences of the characters in the novel. You take it in a very subjective manner. No? That's a good example, a very immediate example of affective stylistics. So the overview of the reader response theory, it focuses on the responses of the reader to literary text, the act of reading. It analyzes the act of reading, not writing, not even the text, not the author, but reader's experiences. It shares two beliefs that the role of reader cannot be omitted. So it's impossible to neglect the reader. Second, he is not a passive consumer. Reader is not a passive consumer of meaning, but active creator of meaning. Okay. So that is how we see these two findings of reader response theory. And so it claims different readers may read same text differently. Okay. And sometimes within the same author also, same reader also. So some reader-oriented theories that are there, no single predominant theory. So Hughes and Esser, then Rifat-Ray, then Fish, then Bleek. So Barthes, of course, he's not a reader response theoretician, he's a structuralist, post-structuralist. But because he talked about death of the author, he becomes important. So what do they do? So these are all different writers. They focus on different aspects. One on reader's consciousness, psychoanalytical approach. Then the literary competency is focused upon. Okay, then how there's a response, by the reader, etc. Okay, so they challenge, or they are a reaction to new criticism, formalism, and we can no longer talk about the meaning of text without taking into account the reader. This is the single most largest, biggest, prominent, important contribution of reader response. Putting it simply, nobody bothered about the reader. They only elevated the author and praised the author. But reader response theory said meaning of a text is impossible without the reader. In fact, it is only possible because of the reader. That is the emphasis. So the emphasis on the reader, what happens? It destroys the objective text. text is challenged, first implication. Second, critical implication, critical position, critics, their position is also challenged. And there is an exchange of worldviews. That is, the authorial prominence is replaced by the reader, the privileging of the reader. These are the implications. Then two distinguishing features, that character, it's a kind of a repetition, but I'm putting it inside. So it actually talks about the moral, philosophical, psychological, and rhetorical emphasis. So each individual person, this is actually what it talks to. So the second feature is that the reader is of primary importance. So the authority of the text is also challenged. Authority of the text and the critic and the author, everything. Okay, these are the two kind of implications. So the introcation of the meaning of text, difficulty of fixing meaning. So these are some problems. I thought I can actually focus on this more. This has been my interest, but we don't have time. So the question of ontological and epistemological meaning of words, the impossibility of grasping transcendental signification. Just to putting it very simply, I'm talking actually referring to religion. So if indeterminate meanings are present, and if it is also applicable to religious texts as actually another form of text, then what about access to spiritual truths and reality? That has been my, actually I wanted to focus on that. So self changes, so there is no question of determinate meaning. Language changes, you have floating signs and signified, that are no transcendental signifiers, Derrida says, again no determinate meaning. So in structure, sign and play, you talk about the play, again possible, at least a couple of questions I like to take. So meaning is only an approximation. It is not it's not 2 + 2 is 4. It is approximately 4. In language, it works like that. And this has implication for all human activity, all epistemological interests, including religion. And the challenge of meaning, it has to be overcome if communication is to be ascertained. Probably we need to kind of fine tune, so to speak, reader response theory. So the writer claims I'm done, the text says I'm not finished, and the reader says I'm here to finish the job. So I thought it's a nice way to end this session. So and some references are there. So I thank the Department of English in particular and the college, Dr. Sharad Binod, for giving me this opportunity. So I hope it has been somewhat meaningful, and probably I've tried to clarify certain aspects. So if there are some, I know it's been a long day for you, but if there are some, I think I'll stop sharing this.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So if you have something, maybe.